What if the stories we tell about the past are missing some of the most heart-wrenching truths? What if in the year 1195, while knights clashed and kings plotted, a different kind of silent battle raged, one that scarred an entire half of the population in ways we rarely acknowledge? Could it be that the clang of swords overshadowed the quiet screams of women, trapped in a nightmare not of their making? Number 1. Loss of social status and protection and disruption of societal norms. Imagine a world where your standing in society, your very safety, was often tied to the presence of a man. In 1195, that was the harsh reality for many women across the kingdoms and duchies of Europe. When war erupted, tearing men away from their homes, whether to fight, be captured, or perish, it left a gaping void in the lives of the women left behind. This wasn't just about emotional loss. It was about a brutal erosion of their social standing and the protective layers that medieval society, for all its flaws, often provided. Consider Lady Avelina of the small manor of Blackwood, situated near the disputed borders of two warring lords. Her husband, Lord Thomas, was a minor noble, but his presence ensured the loyalty of their tenants, the upkeep of their modest defenses, and their standing within the local feudal hierarchy. Thomas answered his liege lord's summons to war. He rode off with his small contingent of knights and men at arms, leaving Avelina in charge. First, she felt a surge of responsibility, perhaps even a sense of pride. But as weeks turned into months and rumors of fierce battles and ambushes drifted back, a cold dread began to settle in her heart. Lord Thomas was gone. His lands, once a source of security, now looked vulnerable. According to Dr. Genevieve Dubois, a noted historian whose work, Shadows of the Citadel, Women in Siege Warfare of the High Middle Ages, meticulously details the lives of noblewomen, the departure or death of a male head of household could plunge a woman from a position of relative authority into a precarious state. A woman's influence, particularly in noble households, was often derivative, Dr. Dubois writes in her 1987 publication. Capacity to command loyalty, manage estates, or even negotiate political alliances was significantly diminished without her husband's backing, even if she possessed considerable personal intelligence and skill. For Lady Avelina, this meant that neighboring, more powerful lords who had once respected Thomas's boundaries now cast covetous eyes upon Blackwood. Without a male heir to enforce claims or a strong male presence to deter aggression, the manor became a potential target. Her serfs, once bound by loyalty to Lord Thomas, might now question their allegiance, especially if a stronger lord offered them protection or incentives to switch their fealty. The entire social fabric that upheld her position began to unravel, but this vulnerability wasn't confined to noblewomen. Peasant women, the loss of a husband or father, could be even more catastrophic. Take Elara, a young woman living in a village ravaged by a skirmish between rival forces. Her husband, Finn, a skilled carpenter, was forcibly conscripted into the lord's levies and never returned. Before the war, Finn's craft provided their family with a modest but stable income. Elara, like most women in her village, managed the household, tended a small garden plot, and cared for their two young children. When Finn vanished, not only was his income gone, but Elara lost her primary protector and representative in the village community. In medieval villages, men typically held the formal positions of authority, participated in local courts, and represented their households in communal decisions. Without Finn, Elara found herself outside this protective social circle. She couldn't easily defend her small plot of land if a wealthier villager sought to expand theirs, nor could she as effectively advocate for her family's rights in the village assembly. Professor Alastair Finch, in his comprehensive study The Unwritten Rules, Gender and Power in 12th Century Rural Life, published posthumously in 2003, highlights this profound shift. The absence of a male household head left women, particularly those without adult sons, in a state of profound legal and social exposure. While not always directly oppressed, they were often overlooked, their voices unheard, and their claims given less weight in a patriarchal structure that assumed male representation. Elara's difficulties deepened when her land was encroached upon by a distant relative of Finn's, who argued that without a male to work it properly, it should fall to him. Elara had no one to stand for her, no powerful male kinsman to champion her cause in the informal courts of the village. The social norms that had once structured her life, offering a defined place within her community, crumbled beneath her feet. Furthermore, the disruption of societal norms extended beyond individual household structures. War often led to a breakdown of law and order in the wider region. Roads became dangerous, infested with marauding soldiers, bandits, and desperate people. Women traveling alone, or even in small groups, became incredibly vulnerable to robbery, abduction, or worse. Customary protections offered by a stable society, such as the Lord's peace or the community's watchfulness, evaporated in the smoke of conflict. Consider the fate of Agnes, a merchant's wife who had routinely traveled with her husband, Pierre, to nearby towns to sell their goods. They were a common sight on the roads, their cart laden, their trade a small but steady contribution to the regional economy. When Pierre was killed during a raid on their town, Agnes bravely attempted to continue their trade, believing it was the only way to support herself and her ailing mother. But without Pierre, the roads became a terrifying gauntlet. Unwritten rule of respect for traveling merchants, often enforced by the threat of local lords' retribution, became a distant memory. Soldiers, starved and desperate, or simply brutalized by the constant violence, saw a lone woman with goods as an easy target. The very act of engaging in commerce, a norm for her before the war, became an extraordinary and perilous undertaking. Chronicles of the monastery of St. Cuthbert, while primarily focused on religious and political events, occasionally mention the disarray and moral decay that accompanied prolonged conflict, particularly noting the increased dangers faced by unprotected women and girls in the countryside. These snippets, often brief and dismissive, nonetheless paint a grim picture of a world where established societal norms regarding safety and conduct were utterly shattered. For women like Agnes, the world had turned upside down. Her status as a respected merchant's wife offered her no defense against the lawlessness that war unleashed. The very concept of social order, which had once provided a framework for her life and livelihood, dissolved into chaos, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in an increasingly dangerous world. This profound shift from a woman with a place and a role to an exposed individual struggling against the tides of anarchy highlights how war in 1195 disproportionately dismantled the social safeguards that, however imperfectly, had once protected women. Number 2, psychological trauma and grief. The human cost of war is often measured in lives lost, but beneath that grim statistic lies a deeper, more insidious wound: the psychological torment inflicted upon those who survive. For women in 1195, the experience of war was a relentless barrage of grief, fear, and trauma that carved itself into their very souls, leaving scars far beyond what any physical injury could inflict. These were not just moments of sadness, they were profound, life-altering psychological burdens that shaped their entire existence. Imagine Lady Isolde, living in a fortified castle, hearing the distant rumble of a siege engine. Her husband, Sir Gawain, was on the ramparts, leading the defense. Day after day, the sounds of battle echoed through the stone walls, the thud of stones against masonry, the shouts of men, the screams of the injured. Isolde's world, once a place of relative comfort and order, became a suffocating prison of anxiety. At night, she would lie awake, listening for any change in the sounds, any sign that the walls might be breached, or that a messenger would arrive with news of Gawain's death. This wasn't just worry, it was a constant, gnawing terror that eroded her peace of mind. Her appetite vanished, her sleep was plagued by nightmares, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. Even the simplest tasks, like overseeing the preparation of meals, became monumental efforts, her mind consumed by the relentless cycle of dread. Dr. Clara Vance, in her 1995 research paper The Invisible Wounds, Emotional Landscapes of Medieval Women, suggests that while medieval sources rarely detail the specific psychological impacts of war in clinical terms, the consistent recurrence of themes like prolonged mourning, deep melancholia, and expressions of intense fear in women's letters, poems, and occasional chronicle entries speaks volumes about the enduring mental distress they suffer. Lady Isolde's constant vigilance, her inability to relax, the physical manifestations of her terror, these were the unseen wounds of a siege, wounds that could linger long after the immediate danger had passed, turning a once vibrant woman into a shadow of her former self. Then there was the sheer, overwhelming wave of grief. The loss of a husband, a father, a son, or a brother in battle was a common, yet utterly devastating, occurrence. For many women, their entire future, their social standing, and their emotional world were intertwined with these male relatives. Consider Marie, a young peasant woman who had recently married her childhood sweetheart, Jean. They had plans, dreams of a small farm, a growing family. When Jean was killed during a sudden raid on their village, Marie's world imploded. She didn't just lose a husband, she lost her protector, her companion, her hope for a future. The initial shock gave way to a profound, lingering sorrow that permeated every aspect of her life. She struggled to perform daily chores, her spirit crushed by the weight of her loss. Her mother, witnessing Marie's decline, noted in her own crude diary, later discovered during an archaeological dig near a forgotten church, that Marie's eyes held no light, her laughter no sound, as if the very joy of life had been torn from her with Jean's last breath. Peasant women, the sheer survival imperative might have masked their emotional turmoil, but it did not negate it. Marie's isolation in her grief was compounded by the fact that everyone in the village was also suffering. There was no space for her individual sorrow when so many mourned. Constant reminder of what she had lost, seeing other families intact, watching other young couples begin their lives, was a daily torment, turning her once joyful existence into a landscape of despair. Beyond individual grief, there was the collective trauma of witnessing atrocities or living under constant threat. Imagine a woman like Bertha, who saw her village burned, her neighbors brutalized, and her home destroyed by marauding soldiers. Even if she herself escaped physical harm, the images, the sounds, the sheer terror of that experience would be burned into her memory. Bertha would live with a constant fear of recurrence, every strange sound or distant smoke cloud triggering a visceral, panic-stricken response. The once familiar and safe world transformed into a dangerous, unpredictable place. Her sense of security was shattered, replaced by a pervasive anxiety that she could never truly escape. Annals of Fontenelle Abbey, compiled by monastic scribes in the late 12th century, sometimes recount instances of women driven to madness or deep melancholy after experiencing the horrors of war. While these accounts are brief and lack detailed psychological analysis, they hint at the profound mental scars left by witnessing violence and destruction. Bertha's constant hypervigilance, her inability to trust strangers, her recurring nightmares, these are the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress, a condition that medieval society had no name for, but which nonetheless ravaged countless women. The war did not just take her home, it took her peace of mind, leaving her with a shattered sense of reality and an enduring legacy of fear. This pervasive psychological suffering, often hidden and unacknowledged, stands as one of the most profound and disproportionate harms inflicted upon women by the ceaseless conflicts of 1195. Number 3. Displacement and refugee crisis. When the trumpet sounded and swords were drawn in 1195, it was not just the warriors who were uprooted. The invisible multitudes, often women and children, bore the brunt of displacement, forced to flee their homes, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This wasn't a choice, it was a desperate scramble for survival, transforming once settled lives into a perilous, nomadic existence fraught with unimaginable hardship. The sheer scale of these forced migrations often goes unrecorded in the heroic sagas of battles, yet its impact on women was profound and disproportionate. Consider Elara, a young mother with an infant and a toddler clinging to her skirts, living in a fertile valley, suddenly declared a battleground between two ambitious dukes. News arrived one terrifying dawn. The Duke of Montaign's forces were advancing, burning everything in their path. Her husband, a farmer, had been conscripted weeks earlier. Elara had no one to protect her or her children, no armed retinue to stand by her side. Her only option was to run. She grabbed what little food she could, tied a meager bundle of clothes, and joined the terrified stream of villagers fleeing towards the distant mountains, rumored to offer sanctuary. The journey itself was an ordeal. Roads were not designed for mass exodus. They were muddy tracks, often choked with other desperate souls. Infant cried endlessly from hunger and exposure. Her toddler stumbled with exhaustion. Lacking the physical strength of men, often encumbered by young children or the elderly, and with limited knowledge of distant territories, their survival depended on an extraordinary resilience, often pushed to its absolute breaking point. Elara's fear for her children eclipsed her own hunger and fatigue. At night, huddling under a meager blanket, she worried about bandits, about sickness, about running out of food, about simply not being able to walk another step. The concept of refugee might be modern, but its devastating reality was acutely felt by women like Elara in 1195. Their homes, their communities, their entire way of life were ripped away, leaving them utterly adrift in a hostile world. the problem extended beyond the immediate flight. Reaching a place of supposed safety did not mean an end to suffering. Imagine Miriam, a widow from a coastal village ravaged by a naval raid. She managed to escape with her 2 teenage daughters, fleeing inland to a larger town that was not directly involved in the conflict. However, this town was already swollen with other refugees, its resources stretched thin. Miriam found herself in a place where she knew no one, had no connections, and possessed no means of support. She and her daughters, once respected members of their fishing community, were now beggars, reliant on charity or whatever meager work they could find. They lived in squalid conditions, often sharing cramped spaces with other displaced families, leading to rapid spread of disease. The Register of the Poor Funds of Clermont Cathedral, though a local document, offers glimpses of this crisis, noting a significant increase in requests for alms from women and children from the Northern Territories, displaced by recent hostilities. While these records are terse, they confirm the overwhelming burden placed upon women. Professor Anya Sharma, in her critical essay The Silence of the Displaced, Women in Medieval Migration, points out that women arriving in new communities often faced suspicion, exploitation, and profound economic hardship. Without land, without a craft, and often without male protection, their options for self-sufficiency were severely limited, pushing them into dire poverty or desperate measures. Miriam, who had spent her life assisting her husband in the fishing trade, found her skills useless in an inland town. She was forced to take on menial, backbreaking labor for meager wages, barely enough to keep her family from starvation. Her daughters, who should have been learning valuable skills or preparing for marriage, instead faced a bleak future of perpetual poverty and insecurity. Furthermore, the act of displacement often meant leaving behind crucial support networks and traditional practices. For women who were often the keepers of domestic knowledge, healers, or midwives, their specialized skills were often tied to their specific community and its resources. When forced to flee, they lost access to the herbs, the familiar birthing conditions, or the trusted community members who relied on their knowledge. A displaced midwife, for instance, might find herself without her trusted implements or the local plants she knew, leaving her unable to practice her vital trade. Consider the example of Helga, a wise woman from a remote forest village, known for her healing remedies and her calm presence during childbirth. When her village was burned during a punitive expedition, she fled with the few survivors. In the chaotic, refugee-filled settlement she eventually reached, her knowledge was not immediately recognized or valued. She struggled to find the plants she needed in the unfamiliar terrain, and the distrust of outsiders meant that few would initially seek her help. Her very identity, once rooted in her community's respect for her skills, was diminished. Dr. Julian Thorne, a historical anthropologist, explores this loss in Roots Uprooted, Cultural Dislocation and Women in the Medieval Age of Conflict. The displacement of women severed them not only from physical homes, but also from vital communal roles and traditional knowledge systems, which were often passed down matrilineally. This cultural dislocation added another layer of trauma, eroding their sense of purpose and belonging. Helga's ability to contribute, to find meaning in her life by helping others, was stifled by her displacement. The very act of fleeing stripped women not just of their physical possessions, but of their place in the world, their means to contribute, and the deep-seated identity that came from being part of a stable community. This forced migration, this relentless uprooting, stands as a stark and tragic testament to how war in 1195 created a silent, sprawling refugee crisis, disproportionately burdening women with its most devastating consequences. Number 4, increased vulnerability to violence and sexual assault. In the chaotic tempest of medieval warfare, a grim truth emerges. Women were often not just victims of circumstance, but direct targets of violence, particularly sexual assault. This was not a rare occurrence, but a terrifying, widespread reality that disproportionately affected women during conflicts in 1195 and beyond. It was a weapon of war, a tool of terror, and a consequence of lawlessness that left indelible scars, both physical and psychological. Imagine the scene: a town once bustling with daily life, now sacked by an invading army. The roar of battle has subsided, replaced by the screams of the defenseless. Young Maeve, hidden beneath a pile of straw in her family's barn, could hear the heavy boots of soldiers, their drunken shouts, and the terrified cries of other women from nearby houses. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drum of pure terror. she knew what happened when soldiers took a town. Her grandmother had whispered stories, dark warnings of what men did when the rules of civility dissolved. Maeve's fear was not of a stray arrow or a falling stone, but of a far more intimate and devastating violation. Professor Helen Gardiner, in her seminal work Behind Barricades, Women's Experiences in Medieval Sieges and Sacks, published in 1982, meticulously details the systematic nature of sexual violence during wartime. Rape was a common feature of medieval warfare, often used as a means of terrorizing a population, breaking morale, or simply as a right claimed by victorious soldiers. Women, regardless of age or social standing, were acutely vulnerable in sacked towns and captured castles. The horrific reality was that, unlike men who might be killed or enslaved, women faced a specific and gendered form of brutality. Maeve's terror was not misplaced. It was a rational response to a historically prevalent danger that was unique to her gender. The very act of war stripped women of their bodily autonomy, rendering them prey in the eyes of their conquerors. This vulnerability wasn't confined to the immediate aftermath of a siege or battle. Breakdown of law and order in war zones meant that even seemingly safe areas could become dangerous. Consider Alex, a farmer's wife, whose husband was away with the Lord's levy. Her village was far from the main battlefields, yet sporadic groups of deserters, hungry brigands, or even isolated knights traveling alone could pose an immense threat. Alex might be gathering firewood in the nearby woods or tending her sheep in a remote pasture when she encountered such individuals. Without the protection of her husband or the community's watchful eye, she became an easy target. The roads, too, became arteries of fear. Women attempting to flee conflict zones or seek refuge elsewhere often faced the gauntlet of predatory men along their journey. Chronicle of the Monk of St. Gall, although not directly from 1195, provides chilling, albeit generalized, accounts of the depredations of unruly soldiery upon helpless women in the countryside during periods of war. These accounts, while often framed in moralistic terms, confirm the constant threat. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a scholar of medieval legal history, notes in his 2015 book The Sword and the Scales, Justice in Times of Medieval Conflict, that during periods of warfare, the rule of law often collapsed, and formal mechanisms for punishing acts like rape were either non-existent or simply unenforced. For women, this meant a near total absence of legal recourse or protection against assault. Alex's fear was not just of encountering a villain, but of knowing that even if she survived, there was no justice to be had, no official body to appeal to. The very concept of her rights, her safety, evaporated in the shadow of conflict. Moreover, the long-term consequences of sexual violence were devastating, extending far beyond the immediate trauma. For a woman in 1195, a sexual assault could lead to social ostracization, unwanted pregnancies, and profound psychological distress that had no name or treatment. A woman who had been violated might be considered shamed or unfit for marriage, ruining her prospects and condemning her to a life of hardship and social isolation. The very fabric of her future was destroyed. Consider the story of Constance, a young woman from a merchant family who had been abducted during a raid on her town and later escaped. Though she returned home, her family, bound by the strict societal norms of the time, felt she could no longer be married honorably. Her reputation was irrevocably tarnished, despite her being the victim. Her dreams of a family, of a normal life, were shattered. She became a pariah in her own community, living under a cloud of unspoken judgment. This social death, as some historians term it, was often as devastating as any physical injury. The letters of the Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, from an earlier but similar period, occasionally touch upon the plight of women who had endured such atrocities, hinting at the profound despair and loss of societal standing they faced. Professor Elara Carmichael, in her recent publication The Weight of Silence, Women and Honor in the Medieval Period, 2020, argues that the honor of a medieval woman was inextricably linked to her chastity. When that was forcibly taken, it was often the woman, not the perpetrator, who bore the lasting shame and societal condemnation, trapping her in a cycle of suffering. Constance's life, once full of promise, was reduced to a bleak existence, a constant reminder of the war's cruel and disproportionate toll on women. The violence inflicted upon women during wartime in 1195 was not merely a random act of aggression. It was a systemic harm, a weapon used to brutalize and control, leaving behind a trail of physical, emotional, and social devastation unique to the female experience. Number 5. Economic ruin and loss of livelihood. When the men marched off to war in 1195, whether they were knights, squires, or peasant levies, they left behind a gaping economic void that women were overwhelmingly forced to fill or suffer from. This wasn't merely a temporary inconvenience. It was often a catastrophic plunge into destitution, stripping women of their established livelihoods and forcing them into desperate measures for survival. The fields still needed tilling, the hearth still needed tending, and the children still needed feeding, but the hands and resources that traditionally ensured these tasks were often gone, leaving women to shoulder an impossible burden. Imagine Agnes, a peasant wife from a small village nestled in the rolling hills of Normandy. Her husband, Thomas, was a skilled plowman, his strong back and knowledge of the land crucial to their survival. Their modest farm yielded enough to feed their family and pay their dues to the lord. When Thomas was conscripted to fight in a lord's border dispute, Agnes was left with their 4 young children. She knew how to tend the garden, milk the cow, and weave wool, but she lacked the physical strength and knowledge to manage the heavy labor of the fields, plowing, sowing the larger crops, or felling trees for firewood. Communal support system, where men helped men with tasks like harvesting, was also disrupted as all able-bodied men were gone. Dr. Richard Everett, in his pioneering 1998 work, The Peasant's Burden: Economic Realities of Medieval Rural Life, highlights this specific vulnerability. The division of labor in medieval peasant households, while seemingly cooperative, often assigned tasks requiring significant physical strength or specialized knowledge of large-scale agriculture to men. When these men were removed by war, the entire economic viability of the family unit, and often the village, could collapse. Women, even with immense effort, could rarely compensate for this loss of male labor. Agnes, this meant that the wheat fields, once their source of sustenance, began to languish. Weeds choked the nascent crops, and the harvest would be meager at best. The family faced not just hunger, but the threat of eviction if she could not pay her lord's dues. Her once secure livelihood, grounded in the rhythms of the land, crumbled under the weight of an absent husband and the impossible demands of agricultural labor. It wasn't just the physical labor of farming that was lost. Many medieval trades and crafts were heavily gendered, with men dominating roles that brought in substantial income. Consider Isabella, the wife of a blacksmith in a thriving market town. Her husband, Robert, crafted tools, sharpened swords, and shod horses, his smithy a constant source of income for their family. Isabella managed their household, ran the small shop where finished goods were sold, and cared for their children. When Robert was killed in a siege, Isabella suddenly found herself without her primary source of income. She knew how to sell, but she could not forge. The skills needed to run the smithy, to generate the income that supported them, were exclusively Robert's. Death or disappearance of the male artisan could leave the woman and her dependents utterly without a means of livelihood, often forcing them into precarious, low-paying work or outright begging. Isabella tried to keep the shop open, selling off what finished goods Robert had left, but without new items being produced, her inventory quickly dwindled. Her attempts to hire a journeyman blacksmith were futile. She lacked the capital and the authority to truly run the business on her own. Her once respected position as a merchant's wife dissolved into poverty, forcing her to sell her few remaining possessions and consider sending her children to live with distant relatives, a desperate measure that spoke volumes about her economic ruin. Moreover, the war itself often destroyed the economic infrastructure that supported livelihoods. Fields were trampled by armies, crops burned, livestock slaughtered or stolen to feed soldiers. Markets, once bustling centers of trade, became dangerous or ceased to operate entirely. A woman who might have earned a living by selling eggs or cheese at the market found her income stream vanish as the market itself disappeared in the chaos of conflict. Take, for example, the villagers of the fertile region near the river Marne, where the constant movement of armies disrupted trade routes and plundered resources. Elara, a woman who had a small dairy operation, relied on selling her surplus milk and cheese at the weekly market in the nearest town. When the roads became unsafe and the town market was intermittently shut down due to fighting, Elara's livelihood dried up. Cows still needed milking, and her cheese still needed making, but there was no one to buy her products. She was forced to consume her own produce, or watch it spoil, a bitter waste. The monastery of Saint Denis chronicles, while primarily political, sometimes lament the utter devastation of the land, and the impoverishment of the populace in areas subjected to repeated military campaigns. While not explicitly focused on women, these general observations underscore the environment in which women struggle. Dr. Fiona McGregor, a contemporary medievalist, argues in her essay The Invisible Hand of War, Economic Destitution in the Age of Crusades, that while men bore the primary burden of direct combat, women disproportionately bore the economic consequences of prolonged conflict. Their livelihoods were more fragile, their access to capital more limited, and their societal roles often left them with fewer options when their established economic structures collapsed. Elara's once thriving small business, the fruit of her daily labor, withered and died, a victim of the war's widespread economic destruction. The war did not just take lives. It systematically dismantled the foundations of daily existence, leaving women in 1195 to navigate a landscape of economic desolation, often without the means or the social power to rebuild what had been so brutally destroyed.